Thank you, Stavros.
Okay.
Good day, everyone. I'm just going to leave video off over here to save bandwidth as I present, and just want to thank Diana in advance for controlling the slides for me. So can we move to the next slide then, please? Awesome, thank you. So in this quick session, I'm pleased to be able to update you on the benchmarking working group's activities to date, and I'll also be looking to get any feedback that you might have, specifically on our proposed methodology, our approach for the benchmarking of the code against the US requirements, as well as on our anticipated timeline. On the next slide, please. So as you've heard, the benchmarking project is a staff-led initiative, and the working group was established in April. On the working group with me are Richard Fleck, and up until this month, Denise Canavan. And as Stavros mentioned at the start of our session today, Denise is stepping off the working group as she's taking on some new responsibilities at her firm and will be leaving her IESBA TA role. So I just want to thank Denise for all of her efforts on the project to date and wish her all the best in her new role. And as Stavros also mentioned, we're fortunate to have Rich Huskin joining the group going forward. So welcome, and thanks to Rich as well. In terms of the staff handling this project, Sylvia is our project lead, and we have Deanne acting in the oversight role, so we've got great staff resources on board as well. So with respect to activities to date, we're still very early days on this project, but we have had 2 virtual meetings so far to decide on our approach and methodology, and we've done some additional high-level work that I'll come back to in just a minute. And next slide, thank you, that's perfect. But before I get into our approach, let me just speak a bit about the background and impetus for the project. So in the past, there's been some concerns that the IESBA code and its principles-based approach, as represented by the central nature of the conceptual framework, there's been concerns from some stakeholders that the code allows for too much flexibility and judgment on the part of auditors and audit firms. And some of these stakeholders have the impression that national laws and regulations that are more rules-based are also more robust and more enforceable. But these views don't capture the complete picture. They don't always give full credit to the rigor and strength of a principles-based approach and the way the conceptual framework and the specific provisions work together. It's also important to note that with the revised and restructured code, the independence framework has changed significantly since 2011, which is the last time that a major benchmarking study was undertaken. And of course, as we're all aware, it continues to be revised and enhanced through projects such as NAS and FEES. So one of the key aims of this benchmarking initiative is to highlight the strength of the conceptual framework and the independent standards overall, and to demonstrate to key stakeholders, such as regulators, national standard setters, audit oversight authorities, to demonstrate to them how the IESBA's independence framework has evolved over recent years. So in other words, the benchmarking is intended to provide both an operational comparison tool as well as being a strategic exercise to promote the strength of the code in regulating the behavior of auditors and to help overcome some of the misconceptions that might still remain in the marketplace. And if I can get the next slide. So building on this context then, the overall objective of the benchmarking is to provide a comprehensive comparison of the code's independence framework with equivalent provisions from other jurisdictions. And as a starting point, the benchmarking project will map the code's independence provisions for PIEs against the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission rules, with the SEC chosen because its rules represent one of the most recognized independence frameworks. In the future, the intent, subject to resource availability, of course, would be to expand the mapping to include other jurisdictions, such as the EU or Canada or others. And the next slide, please. In the benchmarking, we'll be laying out the similarities and differences between the independence frameworks by comparing provisions regarding the scope of the frameworks and their overarching principles, and also regarding what's allowed in terms of the relationship between an auditor and an audit client, and the activities that are prohibited or permissible. And specifically, the mapping will focus on the existing rules themselves and steer clear of how those rules might be interpreted or enforced in practice. Okay, and the next slide then. In the evaluation, we'll not be looking to state an opinion on which framework is more stringent. Instead, we're going to be using more neutral language and looking at determining equivalence of the relevant pairings or groupings of provisions. And by equivalence, what we mean is that if two provisions are equivalent, then they apply to the same type of entity, they apply to the same circumstances or services, and that they achieve the same effect in terms of, for example, whether an activity is permitted or prohibited. So our work will highlight the similarities and differences in any of these elements. The next slide. Okay, so just a quick look at the scope of phase one. So in the first phase, as I mentioned, we're comparing the code to the US framework. So in the code, that's the PI provisions in Part 4A, but also in the context of Parts 1 and 3 to capture that building blocks approach. And from the US framework, our scope is the SEC rules, but also the ethics and independence rules of the Public Company Accounting Oversight Board, PCAOB. And as with any benchmarking project, one of the challenges is that standards are not static. So importantly, we'll be capturing the changes to the code that come out of the NAS and PEACE projects, and also keeping an eye on the expected changes to the SEC rules as those come through. Okay, and moving on. So in terms of the methodology for the benchmarking then, it's important to note that similar to the code's breakout between the conceptual framework and then specific provisions, the US framework has something similar. So although the US framework is often referred to as being very rules-based, in the US framework, they also include strong overarching principles that are then supported with specific requirements. So with this in mind then, the working group proposes that the benchmarking be undertaken based on two different levels. So at that higher level, the focus will be on comparing the overarching approach that's taken by the IESBA code and its conceptual framework against the SEC's general standard, their overarching piece. And that'll pick up those overarching high-level approaches between the two. And then at the more detailed level, the mapping will use a paragraph-by-paragraph approach following the structure of the code and capturing that part of the comparison in more of a database-style model. And this provides a full systematic analysis. It'll be easier to update with current and future changes to the code. But of course, the comprehensive benchmarking database is likely going to be too extensive to be used directly by most stakeholders. So summary information resulting from the initiative will be presented in a format or potentially multiple formats that are most responsive to stakeholder needs. On the next slide. Thanks. And I just want to spend a few minutes on the initial work that's been done so far, looking at that overarching or conceptual approach. So as I mentioned, the US framework has a number of higher level principles, and they're found within the general standard of the SEC requirements. The general standard basically says that an auditor won't be seen as independent unless they can be objective and impartial. And then paragraph 3, the beginning of which is at the bottom there, lays out the situations that would be seen as inconsistent with being objective or impartial. So for example, things like having a financial interest in an audit client or an employment relationship with them and so on. That's what falls in there. And then on the next slide, please. So just to highlight a few of the similarities that we've noted between the code and the SEC rules at that overarching level. First up, both have similar approaches to the concept of requiring both independence in mind or fact and independence in appearance. So with respect to independence in fact or mind, we can see here that the code is broader in terms of explicitly referring to professional skepticism and integrity in addition to the reference to objectivity. And with respect to independence in appearance on the other side then, both the code and the SEC rules call on the perspective of a reasonable outsider, so to speak. But again, the code is broader here in that the reasonable and informed third-party test references integrity, objectivity, and professional skepticism, as opposed to just objectivity and impartiality. And the SEC also sets the context of that reasonable person to be specifically a knowledgeable investor. So similar approaches being taken, but with different framing there. And then on the next slide, please. So as I mentioned a few slides back, paragraph C of Rule 201 reflects the application of the SEC general standard to particular circumstances. But as a starting point, the SEC considers whether a relationship or the provision of a service would result in any of the situations that are noted here, in which case the auditor would not be seen as independent. So if the situation creates a mutual interest or a conflict of interest, if it puts the accountant in the position of auditing their own work, if it results in the auditor acting as client management or as an employee, or if it puts the auditor in a position of being an advocate for the client. And on the next slide. So as I ran through those, you undoubtedly noted the similarities with the code's threats to compliance with the fundamental principles and with the prohibition on assuming management responsibility. And some of these linkages between the concepts are stronger versus weaker. So for example, the idea of a mutual or conflicting interest in the top box there, it clearly calls on the self-interest threat. And that might also relate to intimidation or familiarity threats, but much less of a direct connection with those two. And the other three situations are very clearly tied to the code's concepts. Auditing his or her own work would be the self-review threat. Acting as management is assuming management responsibility. And of course, being an advocate is obviously the advocacy threat. So again, despite the traditional idea that the SEC requirements are rules-based, there is a conceptual or overarching level with a lot of congruence with the code. And that's something that will be spelled out in that higher level section of the benchmarking. And then again, under that will be the paragraph by paragraph comparison of the specific provisions. And on the next slide. Okay, so that's just a really quick update on where we're headed with the benchmarking project. And in terms of the timeline, we expect to have a quick demo or hopefully a fairly extensive demo at that point and an overview of the key differences available in March 2021, with the draft benchmark being done in June 2021 to make sure that we have time to incorporate all of the final changes as they come through from NAS and fees. And from there, then we'd be looking to embark on phase 2 as resources allow. Okay, and on the next slide. Thank you. So the working group is looking for any feedback in terms of the proposed basis and scope, methodology, and so on. And also, given our goal of highlighting the similarities between the conceptual approaches taken in both frameworks and educating stakeholders on the strength of the code's principles-based building block approach, so given that goal, we're also interested in any thoughts on specific areas of comparison that you think might be particularly informative or perhaps sensitive going forward. Looking for any thoughts that you might have on that as well. And in consideration of the time, we're also more than happy to receive comments and questions by email to Sylvia or myself. As I said, we're early days on this project, so we certainly have flexibility in that regard. And Stavros, with that, I will turn it back to you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Laura. And this was an excellent presentation, and thank you for being very punctual on time. This is very good. We have time for a few brief comments or questions or recommendations, suggestions to Laura. So let me open the floor for that. I do see Kim Gibson. Only thing, Kim, briefly, please.
Yeah, for sure. Thanks, Laura. I might have missed it in the beginning, but when we're looking at the SEC rules versus the code, are we looking primarily at the PI rules or all of the rules regarding the SEC comparing? And I just think it's really important to note in the document or the slide that you had where there's a lot of comparisons under the SEC rules, those on at least, I think, the left-hand side of your slide are prohibited, whereas our code uses, obviously, threats and safeguards. So I think we need to be careful to say that they're comparable in many ways, because it'll be interesting to note that those areas that look common may very well be very different than the code versus the SEC rules.
Thank you, Kim. Let me see, Laura, if there are other comments, collect some other comments or questions. Anyone? Ken, do you see another raised?
Not seeing any raised hands at this stage, Stavros.
Okay. Okay. Thank you.
If I can just respond then quickly, yeah, Kim, yes, absolutely, yes, it is the PI provisions that we're focusing on. And with respect to your point about the prohibitions in SEC and potentially the different approaches that are taken, yes, we are aware that that's something that we're going to need to make sure that we manage effectively to accurately show, what the differences are, but also recognizing where there are similarities that come out at the end of the day based on how the decision would be made by following through the conceptual framework and so on.
Laura, just a comment from me. The area of NAS, non-audit services, non-assurance services, is particularly sensitive in terms of the comparison. So I'd encourage your working group to pay close attention to those areas. And also, to the extent there are exceptions under the SEC rules, it'd be good for those to be flagged. I know, for example, the SEC has certain exemptions for small firms. It'd be good to be able to flag those, so at least we have a clear understanding of what's excluded under those rules.
Yeah, perfect. Thanks for that, Ken. Yes, we're obviously we're very aware of the sensitivities around the NAS, and again, that was part of the reason for setting the timeline, making sure that we could incorporate the changes as they come out of NAS and fees, obviously. And yes, with respect to the exceptions in the SEC rules, yeah, we'll be able to capture notes where there are exceptions or particularly notable ideas or areas where we need to make sure that people are aware of those as they relate to very specific circumstances. So yes, absolutely. Thank you for that.
Thank you, Laura. I don't think I see, unless Ken does, I don't think I see any other remarks from the board. No. Okay. So thank you very much, Laura. We look forward to more discussion about that in future. Good presentation.